Welcome everyone to the Global Roundtable hosted by UNEP Finance Initiative. This session is the Pathways to Net Zero, Next Steps for Sectoral Alignment. My name is Jessica Andrews. I'm the investment lead here at UNEPify, and I'm joined by an excellent panel today. First, Antti Malava, the Head of Sustainability and Insights and Analytics at Danske Bank. Elmar Kriegler, Head of Research Department at Potsdam Institute. And Sven Teske, Professor and Research Director at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, University of Technology, Sydney. Welcome all. Thanks for joining us. So in this session, we will cover the concept of net zero and the alignment with 1.5 degrees. UNEPify hosts a number of net zero alliances, and all of them have committed to being science-based in their efforts. Together with our partner Principles for Responsible Investment, we host the majority of the net zero alliances in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. All of these alliances are trying to push towards real economy change and a net zero future. And to do that, they need to have insights on what the science tells us to expect in a net zero future. So I'm joined here today by several members of the scientific community and practitioners in this space to discuss some of the harder questions on how portfolios can be steered towards a net zero future in light of the real economy. With that, we will hear from our panelists on their efforts to steer their portfolios, as well as modeling efforts and the work of the Network for Greening the Financial System, the One Earth Climate Model, and beyond. We like to start the session by asking a first few questions to our panelists so they can open up the scene and discuss the landscape from their point of view. And then we'll dive into some of those harder questions and then finally focus on the next steps for the future. So the first question I'd like to ask goes to you, Elmar. Could you please describe the work that you do with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Network for Greening the Financial System? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jess. Thanks a lot for inviting me. So the work we are doing at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research is looking at long-term global mitigation strategies to reach climate targets. This work is done with so-called integrated assessment models that couple the energy system, the land use system, the economic system, and the climate system. And they are global in scope because in order to understand what the impact of our emissions will be on the climate, we need to take into account all emissions from all regions and all sectors until the year 2100. So that's a tall order, and these models are trying to capture those. They also include other sources, not only CO2, they look at methane and the major sources in the land use sector. And they look also at air pollutants, for example. So we do look into this interplay between air pollution and climate change policies. Since the Paris Agreement, the focus of the community is to really look into scenarios compatible with the Paris Agreement. So scenarios that stay well below 2 degrees and that also limit 1.5 degree by 2100. And those scenarios, the literature, quite a rich body of literature, is assessed by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I have not only worked as a researcher on these scenarios, but also have been author of 3 IPCC reports now, the 5th assessment report in 2014, the 6th assessment report, which was of Working Group 3 on mitigation, which was published just this year in April, and also the 1.5 degree report, special report on 1.5 degree warming. And it's important to point out that the IPCC is not commissioning its own scenarios, but is rather assessing the literature of existing scenarios and then tries to make an assessment and to provide it to the governments of what the literature tells, for example, about pathways towards 1.5 degrees, what type of different scenarios we have in the literature, and what are the options that are seen in those scenarios, in addition to many other things. So there are also sectoral chapters, so deep dives into the sectors. The policy landscape is assessed and policy instruments are assessed. So that's all in the IPCC report of Working Group 3 on mitigation. What has emerged from that is first a database of scenarios in the literature, which is enormously useful. So the database accompanying the 6th assessment report includes 1,200 scenarios with a climate assessment, from 1.5 degree scenarios up to scenarios that don't mitigate at all. And the typical scenarios that the community has been working on is first so-called current policy scenarios, just extrapolating the trends into the future that we see on the ground, and where you can see, okay, this is by far not aligned with 1.5 and 2 degrees. Then we have scenarios where the NDCs, the National Determined Contribution in 2030, are implemented, and then extrapolated in the future, which are also by far not aligned with 1.5 and 2 degrees. There's a large emissions gap in 2030. And then we do have climate Paris compliance scenarios that I mentioned before. So for the NGFS, we have teamed up with colleagues at YASA and PNNL and Climate Analytics to provide scenarios for the finance sector, particularly for the NGFS in this case, to understand transition risk, and also work by Climate Analytics and us at the Potsdam Institute to look into physical risk. And those are bespoke scenarios. So the design was developed by the NGFS, and we have six types of scenarios. One current policy scenario that doesn't achieve the warming, one NDC extrapolated scenario that doesn't achieve the goals, I should say, not the warming, that doesn't achieve the goals. And then we have two scenarios in 2 degree range. One is called an orderly transition with immediate action from now on, even though we haven't done enough so far. So it's still not really orderly what we have done in the past. Another one with delayed action where we even wait longer, which makes things much more complicated. And finally, two scenarios in the 1.5 degree range. One, again, immediately acting now on the target. And another one is making a different sectoral approach where more burden is put on the fuels, on the transport sector than on the electricity sector, which is also a bit disorderly because the electricity sector is an important player in reducing emissions. So that's the type of work we do.
Thank you so much. Excellent overview of what the IPCC is doing to look across all of these scenarios and bring them into the literature and front and center with governments. And as we all know, there's no perfect forecast of how the global economy will unfold. And so we're working with a wide range of scenarios to try to help understand possible futures, as you've described. And one of those, Sven, as the architect of the One Earth climate model, one which financial institutions are engaging with a lot, could you please tell us a bit about that model and how it works and what it intends to accomplish?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the One Earth climate model actually has a very long history. It sort of started as an energy system model from the German Aerospace Center in the early 2000s and was evolved over many steps until it became sort of around 2019, the One Earth climate model. The One Earth climate model includes a bottom-up demand approach and a supply, sort of a supply side for this demand, as well as the emission analysis, sort of a temperature analysis, which is not part of the One Earth climate model, but is actually done by a separate model. So our model basically works bottom up in terms of the energy demand, which means demand identified by actual services. So for example, how many kilometers people drive in cars, in trains right now. So we calibrate the model on a specific real world demand for a wide range of different sectors. And I think the first sort of additional feature is that we broke down the demand sectors to the global industry categorization standards. So basically, investors have specific investment groups or classes. They are on a global level. There are it's GICS, the global industry categorization standard, but there are also there's a European category and an American one, which are sort of similar, not entirely the same. So I think the first model which actually reflects those different industry sectors is the One Earth climate model. We have developed that over the past 3 years. Also we broke down the emissions to scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which are in the debate in the financial sector. So the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are basically sort of a category who's responsible for what emission. So to give an example, the oil industry extracts oil. So the emissions directly connected to that extraction process is basically that's what the oil industry can actually influence. Then scope 2 is usually the electricity used for that process, and basically the carbon emission sort of caused from the electricity generation. And scope 3 is basically the use of the oil. So scope 3 is then sort of the responsibility of consumers, for example, who drive a car. So we broke that down into those 3 sectors, and we actually had to change or sort of advance the methodology a bit in order to avoid double counting, because that scope 1, 2, and 3 concept was actually developed from the World Resource Institute many years ago. I think about 20 years ago, and it was focused on companies, not on countries and industries. So you had to change that a bit. So I think sort of in difference to the NGFS scenarios, this is more sort of hands-on practical to also broken down to specific regions, industries, and countries. We have a number of countries now where we try to develop key performance indicator for the industry, for the finance industry, to set target. So it's not a competition with the NGFS scenarios. They have a wide range of it. We basically take a specific part of that, sort of we develop a benchmark scenario saying, what do we actually need to do in this sector, and this sector, if we want to achieve 1.5 degrees with a carbon budget of 400 gigatons, if we want to achieve the 67% likelihood, or 500 gigatons if the likelihood is 50%. Again, this is not a forecast. This is basically a benchmark. What do we need to do if we want to achieve that? That's not that we say that this will happen. I mean, it would be good that if that would happen, but it's not the case. We just develop a benchmark.
Yeah, thank you so much. And many financial institutions are working against that benchmark, among others, including IA and the scenarios from IPCC. But the One Earth climate model was one in which the Asset Owner Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance of UNEP, did engage with over the last couple years, directly with your team, Sven, to kind of bridge that science practitioner divide. And Antti Malava represents the first asset owner in the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance to have set sectoral targets. This was, really a prime example of putting the science into action and steering with this information in mind. So Antti, if I could turn over to you to talk a bit about the theory of change at Danske Bank and how you are working towards achieving a net zero portfolio.
Sure, thanks, Jesica. It's a pleasure to be contributing to the roundtable. Thanks for inviting. So for us, commitment to achieving net zero portfolio is really a social mandate for climate action. So our theory of change describes why our work matters, what is our long-term goal, and then work backward to identify what we're going to do to get from where we are now to where we need to go. In this process, what is really important for us are the so-called quality control criteria. They really underpin everything we do in our climate commitment. There's 4 criteria. First, the outcomes and the preconditions, they need to be plausible. In other words, they need to be logical. So the order of events needs to be right so that we don't, for example, jump into conclusions before action. So for example, outright divestment as a decarbonization tool, it's rather simple to do and produces immediate reductions in your portfolio, but it might not be sufficient to reach long-term outcomes or the desired impact that we wish to drive in the real economy. Furthermore, we need to be logical in terms of increasing the scope and detail of the targets and the action. And here I think the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance is doing really valuable work with others in the investment community in and keeping the target protocol being revised over time as the knowledge increases. Second, the indicators chosen for target setting, they need to be testable. So in other words, they need to be measurable and convincing to the different stakeholders so that they are motivated for change and we can evaluate the success. We all know the challenges around ESG data, and that's why we really need to anchor the change with science that describes as realistic, measurable, and actionable pathways for various sectors to actually change at the system level. Thirdly, the theory of change needs to be accountable. Our targets need to be accountable, and as such have the right scope so that it is broad enough to leave no gaps, yet focused enough on the key levers and resources available. I think also understanding the scope helps to differentiate between what is beyond our control to achieve and where we can actually claim credit for attaining. This way we can really see that every actor is part of the system, and as such we need to work collectively. Lastly, but very importantly, the theory of change needs to be feasible, and our targets need to be feasible. This means that we need to understand whether we have adequate resources and actions that will realistically achieve long-term outcomes. In terms of feasibility, net zero strategy needs to be first and foremost an investment strategy for us. So a discussion of the outcomes and actions in an investment language with the tools, restrictions, and other conditions that define how investments are managed in the long run. And at Danica, we put quite a lot of effort into translating the commitment into an investment strategy.
Thank you so much. I think you touched on an important area too, what's within your control and outside of your control, as well as the feasibility. So I want to turn back to you, Sven, and ask, what are your views on achieving 1.5 degree? And maybe at a top level, high level, what are some of the most important levers that we have to achieving that in the real economy?
Well, first I have to say that I think it's still okay to aim for 1.5 degree, even though we might miss it and we land at 1.6 or 1.7. So that's not, I think that's not a reason for me to give up on 1.5. However, I think there are some positive news and some not so encouraging news. First, the positive one. I've been part of the IPCC Special Report Renewables exactly 10 years ago. And if I look back, I think what we achieve now with renewables is quite remarkable. And we have a very large market for mainly wind and solar electricity. So that's encouraging. Also, Australia is actually seriously working on a phase out of coal, which if you would have told me 2 years ago, I wouldn't have believed that. So we are actually aiming to phase out coal for our domestic energy supply around 2035, maybe even a bit earlier. So that's about 10 years. That is good. I think there are a lot of sort of measures which we can implement, and we are almost on track. Another one is electric vehicles. We haven't seen so many electric vehicles only like 5 years ago. Right now, you see them every day. It's not the majority still, but you see more and more, which is also encouraging. I think what's worrying is a transition of industry processes takes a lot of time. So, for example, decarbonize the chemical industry, for example, it is not a 5-year plan. It's not even a 10-year plan. That's maybe probably a 15 or 20-year plan. So we need to make sure that the measures we can achieve quite quickly, like decarbonizing the electricity supply, like in energy efficiency measures, must be implemented with no delay to give us sort of at the end of our carbon budget still some room that we can actually move the so-called hard to abate sectors. And I think that's a very important thing. lastly, despite the energy sector, which I think moves in towards decarbonization in the midterm at least, the whole non-energy greenhouse gas emissions from land use, from forests or deforestation is still not even at the peak. It's not. I don't see sort of a reverse of the trend. So I think that's my main worry, that we will not be able to organize the land use, which is, from my point of view, a forest is not just sort of a summary of carbon sticks, which sort of negative emissions, but it's also biodiversity. That's basically what we need to have in mind, and we are unfortunately not on track with that.
Yeah, thank you. Some very sobering but also encouraging thoughts. So Antti, your organization set targets 2 years ago for 2025, so due in 3 years. What are your kind of thoughts and reflections upon hearing some of Sven's points there on achieving 1.5 and the constraints for biodiversity in other sectors?
Yes, I think Sven has really good points, and it's important to continuously monitor how the world is progressing, and be kind of honest in terms of whether we can achieve what we have set to achieve, but not lose focus and momentum. But based on the process I described earlier, we decided to focus on sectoral target setting, so that we could achieve most effective outcome-oriented results, and really maximize the levers we have at hand as investors. It's not the easiest approach. It puts a lot of requirements on corporate data as well as internal work to understand sector dynamics, etc. But it's a very feasible investment strategy, given that it puts less pressure on, for example, shifting from one sector to another, but rather work with each sector. Should I go quickly through the targets? Yes. So we set CO2 intensity reduction targets by 2025 for energy, utilities, transport, steel, and cement sectors within the listed equity and credit bonds portfolios. And these targets, they range from -15% to -35% reductions. We have also set 2025 reduction target for real estate asset class. Furthermore, and very importantly, we have set a target to engage by 2025 with at least 30 high emitting companies within our portfolio or target sectors, and with a focus on companies that we believe that are not aligned emitters. We engage either through collaborative efforts or directly, and we have set KPIs to monitor progress. Additionally, we have set financing transition targets to have at least 50 billion Danish kroner by 2025 and 100 billion by 2030 invested in the green transition. We have also committed in Danske, in Jesica, to work with the Danish government through climate partnerships to increase the green transition in the society, because decarbonization or decarbonizing societies requires collaboration between private and public sector. In terms of the learning points from this exercise, I think the biggest learning point has been to understand how complex the global energy system is, and that in order to approach decarbonization in an impact-oriented manner, you really need to understand each part of the system and how they function together. And this is exactly what science at sectoral level helps us to understand. Start from a complicated system and then simplify the problem statement by considering each part of the system, each sector. And I think this way it becomes more manageable, but also allows to see the potential bottlenecks or roadblocks. So for example, like Sven said, lack of progress in one sector might weaken the ability of another sector to transition. I think also the scientific modeling of the energy societal system has made it very clear why it is of utmost priority not only to decarbonize global electricity generation, but also to expand the value, the infrastructure from generation to distribution, considering things like price variability. Because without making electricity more readily available and predictable, we will not reach the long-term ambitions. I think it's also in this context, it's very important to acknowledge the very nature of science, that it evolves by finding new evidence and uses it to question the current understanding. So we need to be really agile also, understand what levers of change are within our control and how change of external drivers can steer our decarbonization efforts. Yes.
Thank you so much. And yeah, someone where that complexity is not lost is certainly Elmar, looking across, all of the work that you do for IPCC and reviewing the scenarios that are submitted and hearing the comments of our previous speakers. Can you maybe react a little bit more on the evolution of sectoral pathways towards net zero decarbonization and pick up on some of the points that we've just heard here?
Yeah, happy to do so. First, I fully agree with Sven that it's very important to focus on 1.5 degree and achieving 1.5 degree and not be too worried about the fact that there might be then at the peak 1.6 or 1.7 degree warming, as we see in many of those 1.5 degree scenarios the IPCC has assessed, because if we delay further, it will become ever more harder to even stay below 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees, because we are producing new lock-ins into fossil fuel infrastructure, and then having to shift even stronger, even deeper after we have built up further lock-ins. It makes it more and more complicated. And if you look back, we have already delayed substantially since 1992, when the United Nations Framework Convention was put in place. It's now 30 years and emissions have risen by a lot in these 30 years, and that puts us in this difficult situation to have another 30 years to completely get down with our CO2 emissions to net zero CO2 globally. And so time is of essence, and maybe sometimes I do this with my students, but it's so instructive if one just takes a piece of paper, puts the 40 gigatons, around 40 gigatons CO2 emissions we have today, and draws a straight line down to zero, and then calculates the accumulated emissions under this line, which is just the emissions times the time divided by 2. And then can see if I push back this timing of net zero, how much more accumulated CO2 emissions I get. And each ton of CO2 is adding to the warming. And then compare these numbers you get with the budgets, and you see how tight this is. So we need to get down fast, unprecedentedly fast, of course. And if you look at these strategies, they have a distinct fingerprint. So the basic story is quite robust. Decarbonize electricity, do it fast. Mainly use renewables for that. At the same time, electrify transport, electrify industry, electrify the building sector to the extent possible, because then one can use the zero carbon or low carbon electricity and replace some of those fossil fuels in the sectors. Reduce energy demand, and since we electrify, we can do that without limiting energy services. If we are smart about this, some lifestyle change will be important here, so it's not possible to completely ignore this side. And that's also ranges into the land use question, because for the land use dimension, which brings in some other greenhouse gases that are quite potent, like methane in particular is a large factor, nitrous oxide. The amount of livestock is critical, so our dietary patterns are also very relevant. So transitioning to a less meat-rich diet, I'm not talking about completely not eating any meat, but reducing to a less meat-rich diet is an important part of that. Also having some other benefits when we think about sustainable land use, biodiversity, and these kind of things. So that's one part, or that's a key part of the story. If you look into these hard-to-abate sectors, we find them, as Sven said, in the agricultural sector, particularly methane emissions here to get down with them. We find them in the transport sector, in the aviation and shipping industry. So here we look for alternative fuels, like, for example, zero carbon or carbon neutral synfuels, hydrogen. And then we look into the industry sector, high temperature processes, like in the steel industry, cement industry, where CCS might play a role. So that's the type of things where we need to have substitute fossil fuels with non-fossil and zero fossil alternatives.
Thanks, Elmar. And Sven, I think I saw that you wanted to react on some of Antti's points.
Yes, just quickly, but Elmar actually said it. I was just highlighting the importance of the decarbonizing the electricity system. So therefore, it plays a huge role in almost all sectors. And usually the electricity will be generated not from the sector itself. So each sector is so dependent on the utility sector that they actually implement that decarbonization in the system. And also the electricity demand will rise quite rapidly. So for example, in industrialized countries, if the transport sector is electrified, that means that the electricity demand roughly doubles as a rule of thumb. And that additional electricity needs to come from renewables as well. So you need to electrify the traditional electricity sector, plus the additional electricity also needs to come from decarbonized electricity. And that's basically a challenge. It's possible, but we have to have that in mind when we sort of develop systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And very interesting rule of thumb as well. So I want us to look forward and what are your immediate next steps in all the lines of work that you do. But before we do that, I want to do just a quick round. Can you maybe name really briefly the sort of #1 challenge that you see either in your work or globally? Just really kind of a rapid round. What is kind of the main obstacle that you see at this immediate point in time? Sven, is your off mute at the moment? Maybe I turn to you if that's all right.
Yeah. So for me, the crisis we have and the energy crisis we have, I think it's also we have to use it as an opportunity to actually leapfrog into decarbonized electricity generation first, and also to actually jump into measures, maybe energy efficiency, where we really simply reduce consumption and use that period of time to then at 1, 2, 3 years later that we can use that energy and it's generated by renewables. It will take a few years, and especially the heating sector is nothing we can change within 12 months. That takes a bit longer. But I think that we can use the crisis right now as an opportunity. I have seen many debates over the past few weeks, and it was always the debate: how do we actually replace gas? From my point of view, the solution is not to replace Russian gas with Italian, Belgian, Australian gas. It's how do we actually replace gas with renewables and energy efficiency. But the problem we see here, the challenge is very short term, like next winter, versus midterm, like say within the next 10 years. And sometimes it almost contradicts each other. And that's a challenge to actually get that organized.
Yeah. Yeah. Elmar, you just described some of the challenges and some of the solutions, but can you name maybe one obstacle we really do need to overcome to achieve this?
Yeah, I would say, if I just have to name one, phasing out fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are really, they have staying power if you look at it. We talk a lot about ramping up renewables. This is happening. It should need to happen faster. And at the same time, fossil fuels are continuing to be used. And for each country saying, okay, we're getting out of coal, out of fossil fuels, another country is planning on fossil fuels into the longer term or medium term future. It's of course different stories for coal, oil, and gas. So coal, really, we need to get out of coal immediately. But some in some areas of the world, coal is alive and well. Gas, Sven just talked about gas. We have the situation right now, the current crisis. So gas and oil will be used a bit longer, but also here we need to really try to ramp it down as quickly as possible. It will enhance energy security, but there is this intermediate period where we kind of need to live with a mix of particular oil and gas and renewable solutions. So organizing this, but first of all, really removing the incentives. We're still having fossil fuel subsidies on the ground, and it's so easy to have the talk and have all the goals, and then forget that without talking much about it, there's still this fossil fuel support. There's still the fossil fuel plants. There's still fossil fuel use, and there are no plans to change that fundamentally. And here we need to look into, because if we don't, then we will not. We will stay with the high emissions we have, because that's where the emissions come from the fossil fuel combustion, 70% of that. And we've seen that in the past. There's a lot of talk about climate policy and all the great developments we see on the ground, but still the emissions remain stubbornly high. Yeah. And the reason for that is fossil fuels.
Thank you. Antti, as someone who is working with an institution to steer towards this finance change and engage the real economy for this achievement, what do you see as a main challenge?
I can only echo what Sven and Elmar was saying. I think this year has really shown what fossil fuel dependency means, and why it's very evident, and why the work to decarbonize societies is ever more important from many perspectives. I think while we need to respond to events as they happen, it is very, very important that we do that in relation to our long-term goals and not let short-term events kind of hijack the overall long-term ambitions. For us, this really means that when we engage with our investee companies, we see how they respond to this situation, whether they keep the long-term focus and adjust the business as they need in the short term. I think that's the key.
All right, thank you. All right, so I have one final question to all of you, and it's really about, what actions are we taking? What are our immediate next steps, and what do we need, again, to realize this? More on the opportunity side than on the challenges that we've just covered. So in two parts, what are your immediate next steps for your line of work? And what do you need from others, be it the scientific community, policymakers, the real economy, CEOs and actors? What do you need from others to make your next steps in your line of work a reality? And I'll go first to you, Antti, to close this out.
Sure. So at Danica, we're currently evaluating data on new asset classes covered by the target setting protocol of Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. Namely, that is infrastructure investments, as well as increasing our understanding of sovereign debt methodology. I think this incremental approach is really good because it allows to set intermediate milestones and manage one area at a time without causing kind of information overflow at the start. At Danica, we're also thinking how to leverage our learnings and the developments in the community to enhance tracking and communication of our decarbonization journey even better. In terms of the needs from either the scientific community, policymakers, or the real economy, I think firstly, and this is something we always ask as investors, we need more and better quality company disclosure in these relevant metrics so we can evaluate sectoral specific progress better. So this means companies need to start disclosing these metrics, especially on the intensity of production, if we want to follow the sectoral approach. But I think in order to ensure progress at the global energy system level, we also need a lot more policymaker cooperation. So for example, while in Europe, the emission trading system has reached price levels that are incentivizing investments into renewables, globally still only a fraction of greenhouse gas emissions are under such pricing or tax schemes. I think we also need policymakers to work on creating better incentives to decarbonize the energy demand, and not just the supply. And for scientific community, I have a wish to better identify and demonstrate relationships between different planetary boundaries, not just climate, but for example, between biodiversity and climate change. This way, I think we would more likely look at the true long-term solutions rather than replacing one issue with another one. So for example, like climate action with the new problem related to biodiversity crisis. We have seen really good progress on this front, but I think more focus is welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you, Antti. Really comprehensive. I think you've outlined a range of challenges and opportunities that we see across our net zero alliances. Elmar, could I go to you next? What are next steps and what do you need?
Yeah, you have these two questions. What do we need maybe more generally, or we also as a community, and what is our research again, and what are our next steps? On the first one, I think what we need to connect, and I think what we need generally in order to progress things is long-term thinking and strategic thinking. So if it becomes too isolated, just one subsector or just the next 5 years or just the current crisis, what are we doing in the winter? It's very hard to make good climate policy. And of course, our work is taking the long-term perspective. And one thing we need to improve definitely is also to take into account these short-term trends in a timely manner. We had COVID. That was a shock to the economy. We saw the drop in emissions in 2020, and we saw, and that was no surprise, an immediate recovery of emissions in 2021, even a higher level of emissions. We kind of anticipated that. Of course, everybody hoped that would be a trend change, and maybe in the long term there is a bit of a trend change, but we can see now with the crisis, it will be it's a huge impact on the energy markets, the international energy markets. So one part of our research also for the NGFS is to take into account these current trends as they develop, which would mean also to update things more quickly. Yeah. But for the politicians for investors, I mean, investors have a longer term perspective than many of the policymakers. It's important to have this long-term strategic cross-sectoral thinking. Otherwise, it's very hard to find a solution. In terms of our research agenda, besides what I just said, it's really integrating all the things. We are called integrated assessment models, but integrating the climate impacts into our very modeling of pathways so that we can speak along the pathway about the benefits of going through the effort to going to net zero, and contrasting it directly is work we are doing right now in the context of the NGFS. We are working on it to better link the physical risk side to the transition risk side. So that's one. And another important topic is, and that was mentioned by Antti, is to think about a broader goal set, not only the Paris climate targets, but also, for example, sustainable development goals. And so the community is doing a lot of work in this direction now. For example, we published a paper in Nature Climate Change last year on the sustainable development pathways, trying to take into account all 17 SDGs. And that also was assessed by the IPCC. It's one of the illustrative pathways, called shifting pathway in the sixth assessment report. So there's some work here, but more work needs to be done.
Thank you. Sven, quickly to you, impactful last comments.
Yeah, I think for our own work for the One Earth climate model, we try to make more and more specific country scenarios to actually be even more specific in our data, be more specific for more sectors. So have a very practical data set, and that's our goal, and our sort of focus is to create really practical hands-on data sets. And we make sort of that in every iteration a bit more detailed and exact. And that brings me to the second part. What do we need? Data. Sometimes it's a bit flying blind. For example, if we want to model the chemical industry, there are a lot of parts where there's simply no data. We have to put assumptions in the model in order to calculate a pathway, but more data would be actually much appreciated. And in terms of the policymakers, I would say that more long-term energy policies and policies which actually remain in place don't really change a policy every year. Sometimes it is better to have a policy in place which is not 100% perfect, but at least stable, rather than sort of playing around with a policy every 12 months. That is not a good thing to do. And in terms of the real economy, I think I'm coming from the engineering part, and I work with the finance industry now about almost 3 years now. And I actually realized that the finance industry is really honest and really engaged in decarbonizing. And I hope that's sort of continued in the future, that gets implemented. And I think it sends a really good message to the policymakers that there is a really honest approach of decarbonizing, and there's a real commitment. And I hope that translates into a policy framework which are needed from the finance industry to actually make long-term decisions.
Thank you. I don't think I could have summarized it better myself. So I want to just thank all of you for your time and contributions and excellent conversations to this session, but also all the excellent work that you are doing in your own spaces and to drive this change. Thank you very much for your participation today.